what purpose? And basically the answer in this Enuma Elish, which is at least 3,000 years old, perhaps 4,000 years old, from Babylon, is the idea that humans were created by the gods to serve the gods. And we see human origin stories all over the world at different times and different places. We look to religion, we look to mythology, we look to science also for answers about the nature of our existence and how we fit into this reality. Some of you have seen this slide before. Oh, say what is truth? What is the truth about human origins? Today, especially in an LDS culture, we really refer to two primary sources. One is Scripture, and for some of us, also science. Richard G. Scott, in a 2000 General Conference talk, mentioned that both revelation and science are valid approaches to truth. Basically, with science, we are applying our free agency and using our intelligences. We're being good stewards of the intelligences that we have to try to find truth on our own. And one of the methods through which we do that is science, the scientific process. Many people, however, try to disassociate faith from science, but there is most certainly faith involved in the scientific process. We have to make some assumptions to move forward in science. One of those assumptions is that we can understand the universe. We may not be able to. There are some philosophers, as you may have read, that argue that we cannot understand the universe. We cannot understand ultimate truth. We're not capable of it, given the limitations of our senses. Another aspect of this is that we can understand the universe without invoking deity. The general idea there is that because God made it that way isn't a good answer to a question, right? Rather, we ask, well, how did God make it that way, right? But basically, we again don't include theological explanations as observable within scientific methodology. Also, the present is the key to the past. The idea that we can study modern processes and understand how the past unfolded using those same processes, that the principles that govern the universe are essentially consistent through space and time. Also, that our explanations for the things that we see around us should be consistent with the observations that are available to us. And also, we tend to favor simple explanations in science. Not necessarily because they're easy to understand, but rather because they require the fewest assumptions. They're the least convoluted explanations for the observations that we have available to us. And again, that is often why we go with the simpler explanations. The simplest explanations, because we do try to minimize the number of assumptions that we make in science. But we do have to have faith in these assumptions in order to proceed in seeking truth using science. Another really common way to approach science is through induction, inductive reasoning. I'm sure if you've taken just a few basic philosophy classes, you're familiar with induction. Basically, it boils down to pattern recognition. There are things that we can observe in the world all around us. And in those categories of data, such as DNA, for example, or embryos, the embryos of organisms, including humans, anatomy, fossils, behavior, in all of these classes of data, patterns emerge. And what we try to do in science is first describe those patterns, and second, we try to understand, we try to generate explanations for the underlying generating mechanisms. What generates the patterns that we see in these different classes of data? And again, this is how we generally approach science, and this is how science approaches questions related to human origins. Another thing that I should mention is that ideas such as evolutionary theory, when you have a single idea that explains many of the patterns that are generated, we consider those to be very powerful. You can do a lot with them. Not only do we generate these ideas through induction, but then they generate the ability to deduce other things as well. But evolutionary theory is one of these ideas. And some big ideas associated with evolutionary theory is that all life on this earth, whether it be living or dead, originated from a single common ancestor that started on this earth about 4 billion years ago. Life originated once on earth. That's what science suggests, and about 4 billion years ago. And then all living things, as I just mentioned, whether they be in the fossil record or alive today, descended from that single common origin 4 billion years ago, including us. That humans are part of this great chain of being, if you will, and that we evolved, that we are primates, that we developed, that modern humans developed from earlier primates. Now, how do we go about this, right? How do we make these claims? What evidence is there for these big ideas that branch from evolutionary theory? You've probably been introduced to many of these, but I hope to put a lot of them together in a relatively compact amount of time to help you see the patterns and why science argues that the most reasonable explanation for the origin of humans is that we share a common ancestor. We're part of this great grand network of life that began about 4 billion years ago. And the general idea is this, and I should probably mention something else. And I was going to mention it later, but I do want to mention it now, at least briefly. There's a difference between evolution as a pattern and evolution as a process. Evolution just means change over time. And so here we can see some skulls that are very human-like, but they're not exactly like ours. Homo sapiens. We see changes over time. Evolution is change over time. What we do in science is, again, try to come up with an explanation for what is the mechanism that drives that change over time. In many ways, this is an observation. These are bones that are found in a particular order in the rocks. They exist whether we choose to observe them or not, right? These bones exist. And if we consider ourselves honest, truth-seeking individuals, we have to come up with some explanation for this pattern, or these patterns that we see associated with these remains. So evolution by itself is just a term that means change over time. But the question is, the real question is what generates that pattern? And science chooses to explain this pattern as a consequence of descent with modification. Every living thing has parents. We pass on our genetic information to subsequent generations. The physical characteristics that we have are characteristics that we inherited from our ancestors. And we can take that back and take it back as far as you want. Everything has parents. Change occurs over time. Descent with modification is the sort of big picture with respect to science's explanation for process. Now, some of the evidence for descent with modification include things like DNA. So you're probably familiar with this, but if you look at the relatedness or you look at the similarity in DNA between different groups of organisms, the more physically alike they often are, the more similar their DNA is as well. And so that's one thing that we can look at, are patterns in DNA. We can look at patterns in anatomy. We can find the same bones in different organisms. If you want to understand the skeleton of a horse, take a really good class on human anatomy. If you want to understand the skeleton of a dinosaur, take a really good class on human anatomy. Because we all have the same bones, although they are slightly modified, often for different functions. But this is the principle of homology. We can look at amphibians and frogs and birds and bats and whales and cats and horses and humans and see the same bones in those organisms. Descent with modification. Also, there are things like vestigial and atavistic characteristics that make more sense in light of descent with modification. So, for example, every single one of us has many vestigial characteristics, like our tailbone, the coccyx. Every one of us has a little set of fused tail vertebrae. Why do we need those if you don't have a tail? Well, there are other characteristics, and I've talked about these with some of you, called atavistic characteristics. It's basically DNA. In our DNA, we have a lot of segments of DNA that code for nothing in our physical bodies. They're basically segments of DNA that are turned off. But every once in a while, during the recombination of genetic material when we're conceived, some of those segments of DNA accidentally get turned on, like gills or a tail, as you see in this image. Those are considered atavistic characteristics. Why would a human ever be born with a tail or gills or webbing between their digits? Why would we have that DNA in us if it weren't for descent with modification? We can also look at embryos. If you look at the embryos of many organisms, including things as different as fish and tortoises and pigs and cows and humans, when we are embryos, our embryos are very similar to one another. And only through time, which is programmed by our genes, do we start seeing different developmental pathways emerge. If you look at our human embryo, this is a human embryo. We all looked like this at one time. Or we look a little bit like a salamander, right? Little paddle-shaped limbs. There's our tail, the tail that we just talked about. There's the head, the eye, and you can see gills. These are essentially gill arches. And these gill arches become different things as we mature. We see, for example, that this first gill arch that we also find in fish and salamanders and pigs, this first gill arch is what ultimately becomes our lower jaw. And so we see these developmental patterns that also are consistent with the idea of descent with modification. Biogeography is another one. Here's an example of tortoises. The general idea is that you're more likely to be genetically and morphologically or physically related to other members of your same species if you live near them. We see this in tortoises. We see this in humans. Here's the distribution of the human race, of different groups of humans, if you will, races, from an 1851 map, right? This is an 1851 map. But we see that physical differences and genetic differences that exist in humans are geographic. They have a geographic distribution. And so the idea is, again, descent with modification. You're more likely to be descended from people that live close to you, right? And therefore, those physical and genetic groupings are likely to be, concentrated geographically, which is something that we see. Now, another thing that I hope to do today, that I will do today, is go briefly through the geologic record and talk about the geologic history of life and its unfolding through this pathway of descent with modification that ultimately leads to our own species. Now, the Earth is estimated to be around 4.5 billion years old. And not long after it formed, we have evidence for the earliest life forms. If we go back to this first slice of geologic time, one that's sometimes called the Precambrian, which is also referred to as the age of bacteria, we first see evidence for life. And that evidence for life is nearly 4 billion years old. When we look at DNA of living things, and we look at the mutations that accumulate in different lines of the tree of life, and we trace the rate of mutations, and we think of sort of an average rate of mutation through time, how long would it take to reverse all of biodiversity, all those mutations, such that you have a single population of organisms? You can ask that question. And the answer from a DNA perspective is around 4 billion years ago. And now we also have fossils that are nearly 4 billion years old. So relatively early on this old planet, we had life